Matthew, Graybil, thank you so much for getting on with me today. This is actually the second time we're taping this interview because a very unfortunate power outage got rid of the original feed. I just want to say thank you. It's very generous of you to give us your time, and I really am excited to talk to you a little bit about what it's like to be from Lancaster County and to have been on stage with the Lancaster Symphony on its last day before the COVID-19 pandemic sort of sidelined everything. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about growing up in Lancaster County and what it meant to you ultimately to end up on stage with us at Willow Valley in March.
Well, my pleasure, and thank you for having me. Actually, as you know, these concerts were slated to have been held at the Cultural Center at Willow Valley, which is in Willow Street, which happens to be my hometown within my hometown. I grew up right outside of Willow Street, so that neighborhood is, I know every square inch of it, so to speak. So it was a special occasion, and in many ways it sort of felt like coming full circle to come back, as I said, to my hometown in my hometown.
Within the culture of Lancaster and the general area, it's always been incredible to me. I of course have been a member of the Lancaster Symphony since 2011. I'm now married to another member of the Lancaster Symphony for the last several years, and it's worth mentioning that you and my wife actually grew up together and participated in some camps and things like that. So I just wonder if you could talk about the sort of unique musical culture of the Lancaster region and how that's influenced you as a musician.
Well, as you pointed out, there have been many musicians who have grown up in the area and have gone on to do wonderful things in the profession, and I think that that's a testament to the kind of community that Lancaster is and the kind of musical culture that it has. I would say my first concert experiences, in fact, all of the first time I ever heard the great symphonic repertoire, the Piano Concerti, were with the Lancaster Symphony. I think I went to my first Lancaster Symphony concert when I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and there were many other concert series there as well where great artists would come in to perform. So it was just a wonderful area to grow up in. And of course, the community really rallies around young musicians and has done so much for me, and I know many others as well. So again, that's just a testament to the kind of place that Lancaster is. And of course, for all of my life, I've been very fortunate to be part of that community.
You had shared with me an anecdote in the past about seeing Andre Watts with the Lancaster Symphony, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that experience and what that meant for you coming up as a musician.
Right. Well, of course, Andre Watts being the great American pianist who had a special connection to Lancaster and to the Lancaster Symphony. He made his debut, I think, when he was probably 7 or 8 years old, in a concert that was conducted by Louis Weiner, who was, the former music director of the Lancaster Symphony. So he would, on occasion, come back to perform with them over the years. And of course, he had a great relationship with Stephen Gunzenhauser as well. So I was probably 8 or 9 years old myself, and he came to Lancaster, and they did a concert. Actually, they did a concert at Hempfield High School, I think, because they probably needed a bigger space for the performance, and concerto was Rachmaninoff's second concerto. And I can specifically remember, at that concert was the moment where I really felt like I needed to become a musician myself. There was just something about the whole procession of him on stage, his charisma, his presence, and of course the great music. And I remember turning to my parents and saying, I want to be a musician like him.
It's funny you mentioned this. I actually was just caused to remember that moment in my life. I was 17, and it was at my high school in Delaware, and a string quartet, members of the Philadelphia Orchestra, came and played 2 movements of Shostakovich Eighth String Quartet, and just the exhilaration of seeing that music and the visceral power of it really influenced me. And it's just funny that both of us kind of got sucked in by the Russian masters.
That is
And
right.
Um, so after leaving Lancaster, you moved to New York City, and Lancaster has a very thriving community, and I'm sure that New York City, in relation to that, is almost moving at light speed in terms of how competitive and how just gigantic the industry is in that place. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the experience first arriving there and how that has further shaped you.
Sure. Well, I moved to New York to begin studying for my undergraduate degree when I was 19. And of course, coming from Willow Street, New York is about as far of a cry in every possible sense that it can be. I think at that age, I was, first of all, we're all very adaptable at that age. I think that the kind of transition would be much more difficult for me at my age now, but at the time it just felt like another day. I woke up one day and I could hear, all of the hustle and bustle of a big city around me instead of, the quietness of Lancaster County. But I took it in stride, and, also having been at a lot of summer music festivals through my teenage years, I had a lot of my friends from those programs coming to New York to study, either beginning with me in the same year, or they came there later or had already been there. So I think in many ways, socially, I felt like I was already entering a community of friends and people that I knew, and in some cases had known for many years. So that definitely helped with the adjustment.
Now, moving over to Beethoven and the Emperor Concerto, which you were slated to play, and which I'm optimistic that we will get to play in the future. I just wonder if you could tell me a little bit about your journey with Beethoven. As a bass player, we have three concertos. We have to learn all three of them, and which one you get to play, if you ever get to play, isn't really a decision you get to make. And as a pianist, you have your choice of all of the great composers in history essentially have written for the piano at a very high level. And so, what does it mean to explore Beethoven and to play it as a pianist?
Well, I think some of the circumstances surrounding the composition of this concerto are interesting in this particular context. This concerto was started in around 1809 when Vienna was under siege by Napoleon's army. And most of the aristocratic and affluent people in Vienna had left. So Vienna was kind of a ghost town in many ways, and people were actually kind of in a state of lockdown. They were in their basements. Beethoven was at his brother's house in the basement, sort of hiding from the heavy artillery of Napoleon's army. And so I just think that was right at the time when he began writing the Emperor Concerto. So that has a kind of, I guess you could say, poetic significance to today and, the circumstances today. And of course, ironically, to the circumstances of this performance in March that, we began to have. And of course, that coincided precisely with the moment that that performances had to be canceled. And, we all had our own sort of time when we were not able to be with other people. So I think that is a testament to how Beethoven's music really stands for all time, and we can always find a way for it to be fresh and relevant and feel, visceral and alive to us today.
I wonder if you can speak to the physicality of playing a Beethoven concerto, because there's definitely an aspect to the instrument and its evolution that we could talk about, and there's also just a sort of musical one-upsmanship that seemed to be taking place around the time of Beethoven in terms of making the orchestra louder and making generally making a larger statement orchestrally. And I'm sure that must have influenced or bled into his piano writing.
Right. Well, Beethoven was right on the cusp of when the piano was really beginning to evolve. And, in Beethoven's time, the piano was entirely constructed out of wood. If you look 30 years, 40 years later, that had changed with the Industrial Revolution. The piano had a cast iron frame, and along with that, this incredible ability to project and actually compete with orchestral power. Beethoven was notoriously displeased with the piano of his time. He actually had a relationship with the British piano maker Broadwood, and they would send him these prototypes for their pianos, and he would, make suggestions of how they could modify the instrument to have more power and dynamic range. Of course, this is, all before Beethoven was deaf. And I think Beethoven would have been thrilled with the capacity of the modern piano and its ability to project. And he was already beginning to anticipate that quality of the modern piano. If we look, for example, at the very opening of the Emperor Concerto, we sort of establish the piano and orchestra as competing forces, almost as musical adversaries, we could say. If you look prior to that, even at the earlier Beethoven concerti, certainly if you go backward through Mozart, Haydn, going back into the early classical period and the Baroque, the piano had almost more of a chamber-like quality in the concerto form. And here Beethoven was really pushing the boundaries in many ways with the size of the piano and its ability to compete and maybe in some cases surpass the power of the orchestra.
I don't mean to keep pressing deeper into the minutia here, but I'm just always so fascinated with this idea that the template within which Mozart, Beethoven, and maybe Brahms, to some slightly lesser extent, we're dealing with this box of composing where the music had to stay within keys, or it had to modulate sort of in very specific ways in order to satisfy the form of the concerto. And later on in like concertos such as the Rachmaninoff Second Concerto that you referenced, composers had a bit of a free hand with not only the form of the piece, but also with what they would be asking the piano to do in that. And so I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to, what the demands on your hands are when it comes to performing the Emperor, as opposed to, say, a Ravel piano concerto or something a little bit later in music history.
Well, every composer has its own, of course, unique musical voice, its own unique musical personality. But in addition to that, each composer has its own unique physicality. It's almost hard to describe in words, but just exactly how each different composer writes for the instrument, how it feels in the hand, and how you express that. And of course, Beethoven, in this concerto, I think it's a very strong contrast if we look back at his Fourth Piano Concerto. These were two very revolutionary works in many ways, as you mentioned, structural ways as well. If we look at the Fourth Piano Concerto, the very opening, he did something that was completely unprecedented at the time, which was that the piano began. I'll play the opening. And then the orchestra comes in this very remote key, in this very remote place, etc. So that is a very lyrical and, in some ways, intimate expression. In the Fifth Concerto, there's a nobility of expression, a sort of heroic quality that's very emblematic of the style that Beethoven was writing in at that time. We often call this time period the heroic period. And this is certainly reminiscent of that. And if I go back to the circumstances of the composition again, Vienna was under siege. There were these big military operations. There's a quote from Beethoven actually in which he describes it as a city filled with nothing but misery and marching men and guns and cannons. So it's interesting, the last movement of this, for example, has a very military, heroic quality, but also a sort of defiance that I think really says something about who Beethoven was and what his music was meant to reflect. So in this Fifth Concerto, we have a very, very different kind of expression compared to the Fourth, and this would of course been a concerto almost thought of in a symphonic form. Up until this point, a concerto never lasted, say, more than half an hour. This concerto is nearly 40 minutes, and we take the first movement alone, it's 20 minutes. So Beethoven is really pushing the boundaries of the musical form, the size and the length, and there's another interesting anomaly with this concerto that I don't think had any precedent before this, which normally we would have a big piano cadenza at the end of the first movement. Here we don't. We just have a short little Eingang at the very end, a little improvisatory connective passage. So here is another way in which Beethoven is pushing the envelope and trying to sort of break out of the classical mold and open the door for romanticism, which of course is where the musical content is coming before the form.
Yeah, it's kind of incredible. I feel like Beethoven lived in an era where you had to sort of apologize for every modification to the traditional form that you decided to make. And it's a little bit after this time that he's working on his sixth symphony, and he uses 5 movements instead of traditionally 4. And later on, he would sort of go deeper into adding a programmatic element to some of his works. And whereas, before, composers seemed generally fairly content to work within the structures that had been handed down to them by their forebears, Beethoven is really looking to push the boundaries. And you could make an argument that there's a straight line between that and adding a chorus to his Ninth Symphony, or these other sort of modifications. And one of the other interesting gestures that he employs is the very opening of the Emperor Concerto has these 3 very loud chords in the orchestra that are sort of underpinning a very virtuosic flourish in the piano part. And it reminds me of early symphonies where a gesture of 3 loud notes was sort of the call to attention, if you will, for the audience members. And it's kind of incredible to see the workings of this brilliant mind starting to, really piece it all together into something new. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see this concerto sort of modeling things that became more accepted perhaps in the future, or just allowed the genre to move away from tradition.
Sure. Well, that's an excellent question. Back to the idea of eliminating a first movement cadenza, that became a precedent that, was carried on later. I think if you look almost immediately after that to the 2 Chopin piano concerti, we do not have first movement cadenzas in either of them. Rachmaninoff second, we've brought up a few times, does not have a first movement cadenza. And this concerto also has this wonderful sort of collision between the piano and orchestra at the end of the development section, where you really feel this sort of musical antagonism. The orchestra has these thundering chords. The piano back and forth, and then there at the end, the piano kind of gets the last word, or at least I like to think so. So creating this kind of drama between the piano and the orchestra. If we look at the first Brahms concerto, there's almost an identical passage at the end of the development. If we look at the Rachmaninoff concerto, nearly everyone employs that device. So I think this is the first time in the history of the concerto where we had that kind of dramatic interplay between the forces of the piano and the orchestra.
Part of being a professional musician, and part of being somebody that's basically in demand as a performer, is that there's a performative aspect where not every piece of music necessarily clicks with your soul, but it's still your job to model and perform the character of that piece. And I think we've talked a little bit about how the Emperor subtitle, even though it may be sort of apocryphal and not attributed to Beethoven, is definitely an apt characterization of the music. I just wonder, how often do you feel imperious when you're playing piano, and how much of a stretch is it to, to show that character versus what your normal, or like your true identity as a musician sort of manifests?
Well, I think as musicians, we're, in some ways like actors. We have to embody the character of the music no matter what. And I think that that embodiment of the intent of the composer and, our perceived will of the composer has to come before any of our own personal preferences, before any of our own, feelings that we have inside. Of course, when we interpret the music, we are harnessing our own psychology, our own analysis, of course, of the music along with that. So I would say at this point in time, at this stage of my life, I am just thrilled to be able to spend time with such great music. Ask me again in 40 years, maybe I'll have a different an answer in terms of my absolute preference. Now, I certainly have, when I listen to music, preference for different composers, sometimes one over another. I would say that I love the Mozart Concerti purely as music. For me, very little music surpasses it. However, the thrill of playing something like the Emperor Concerto, or something like the Rachmaninoff Third Concerto, or Prokofiev's Second Concerto that came later, as a sort of thrill that maybe is not quite the same for me on a personal level.
Yesterday in our interview, you had mentioned the Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto, and I just wonder if you could talk about the element of the Fourth Concerto that captivates you, and that that I guess has that visceral, satisfactory quality to it, versus the Emperor Concerto.
One of my great loves in music is chamber music, making music with other people, and of course, in a concerto, you get to do that on a grand scale, but sometimes with a different kind of intimacy than you would, playing a sonata with another musician, or, with a group of musicians. And I would say, on a purely personal level, the Fourth Piano Concerto is my absolute favorite as a piece of music. And I find that in that work, he sort of marries the elements of the grand concerto style with chamber-like quality that I find very satisfying, this kind of dialogue between the orchestra, rather than this sort of violent, antagonistic quality between the piano and the orchestra that you get in some cases in the Fifth Concerto and some of the later concerti.
Thinking about one of my favorite elements of this concerto is the second movement, which after this sprawling first movement that is very long and very dense and very powerful, you have the real polar opposite of that. You have this very subdued and intimate texture with the second movement. It's in a fairly remote key. It's in B major. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
B major. What I'm immediately reminded of is the Chopin Piano Concerto second movements, except that Beethoven manages something that's very ethereal and otherworldly, that I think that while Chopin was aiming for that, I don't think he really achieved that, probably due to his skills as an orchestrator more than anything else. But I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that second movement, and what role you see that playing in the grand drama of the concerto.
But it's a very interesting quality that this concerto has. There is this heroic defiance, I think you could call it, in the first movement, but then he really turns deeply inward and within himself in the second movement. Historically, we always think of Beethoven as kind of falling into three time periods. His early periods were much more classical in many ways, stemming from his studies with Haydn, being influenced by high classicism, of course, with his own Beethovenian edge, if you will. Then in the second period, which we call the Heroic period, which of course this is emblematic of, we have this sort of giganticism to it, this kind of heroic quality, of course. We have the Fifth Symphony, we have the Eroica Symphony that are emblematic of that. But then in his late style, which is probably starting about 10 years after this concerto was written, we have Beethoven almost completely turning inward. And of course, by this point in time, he was completely deaf. And we have this real Beethoven as a humanitarian, Beethoven as a transcendental thinker. And in this movement, you feel like he just touches that part of himself in a beautiful way. The piano, again, back to what we were saying earlier, had begun to have more sustaining power. So along with that, you could begin to use the pedal for textural or coloristic effects. And take the very opening of this movement. Beethoven doesn't write many pedal markings in his music, but he's very specific here. To create this kind of atmosphere, this kind of haze. So in my fantasy world, Beethoven would have written another piano concerto. Of course, this was his last piano concerto, which he wrote when he was in his late 30s. Beethoven lived into his mid-50s. So I can only imagine what a later Beethoven concerto would be like in terms of how inward he turns and how he may have evolved his sense of dialect between the piano and the orchestra. But we'll never know.
Yeah, it's interesting what you just illuminated about the pedal. It reminds me of my journey in stepping away from the bass and getting more into music production. That suddenly when you start to work with the computer and you start to be able to make music that you can manipulate after you've played it, that you find that there are all these effects. There's reverb, there's delay, there's these things. And I find that a lot of people, when they're new to it, and myself very much included, you just tend to throw all of that stuff in all at once. And it makes me think, Beethoven having this opportunity to play with the pedal, it's really a chance to create novel sounds that had never really been experienced in the world before that, or had only been implied in the sound of a very reverberant concert hall, that sort of thing. And, if he had had his hearing for longer in his life, what might he have been able to achieve from a color standpoint, being so adept at manipulating all the instruments of the orchestra already?
Right, that is true. But then, on the other hand, we have this vantage point of him so much within his own world. And we can only speculate how that did or did not influence how he heard music and how he wrote music. So that's true, but then at the same time, Beethoven may not have been Beethoven had he been able to hear for longer. We don't know.
That's an excellent point. There's this blend of going within oneself and examining things from that introverted perspective that you're forced to embrace when you lose your primary contact with the outside world. There are things, I think, profound spiritual things that enter into his music from this point on that are really a big part of what we today appreciate about Beethoven. And whereas maybe sonically he would have gotten 3 feet farther down that path, it's not to take away from the miles and miles of progress that he made in terms of what he was able to conceive of without even being able to hear it.
True. That is true.
Yeah. That's just me being a nerd at this point. Like I just am, I guess I'm in awe of that. You know, I rely so much on my own senses to determine how I make music and everything. And you can't even fathom what it would be like to have to fill that all in with your imagination without that actual feedback from the environment.
Right. And there were these anecdotes about Beethoven as he was in various stages of losing his hearing, that he had a preference for taking the legs off of the piano and having the piano on the floor. And I think that that probably allowed him to hear the reverberations of music through his body, you know, into his bones. So I think that's a unique sort of thing to think about, since we know that that was something that he sought, and that may have been something to do with how he felt, or how he perceived music from within himself.
It's fun to speculate about what somebody in that particular situation would have, you know, would experience with technology today. And you know, it's as simple as, if you wanted to feel that nowadays, you turn a dial up on the bass side of things and you get that sensation of, you know, something, the air moving your sternum, that sort of thing. You know, it's a sensation we've all experienced with a loud car driving down the street. You know, it's amazing that you really had to go to extreme lengths to find that in the early 1800s. And you know, it's something we just absolutely take for granted nowadays, the what technology allows people to do when their body doesn't give them all of the familiar comforts that we're accustomed to.
There are these new kind of headphones, you know, that people wear, where it actually puts the sound, you know, through your bone. I don't know if you've tried these, but it allows you to sort of, there are people like to use them when they run, because it allows you to really hear sound around you. Where it's safer, of course, if you're going to be in traffic or around somewhere where you need to be aware of your surroundings, but it still allows you to hear music through that.
Yeah, it's dizzying the amount of problems that we're solving and how quickly we're solving them, you know.
Right.
Obviously not some of the big ones, of course, but you know, some of the smaller and more easily fixable ones certainly are getting checked off. So as we, as a culture, sort of adapt to this new reality of being digital and having to sort of project our avatar out into the world rather than getting to perform live, I'm just curious, what are some of the musical things that you're doing to keep yourself engaged and excited, and or to move your art forward?
Well, of course, this is a very complex and tragic time for all of us, and at the same time, for someone like myself, it is a time to really be idealistic about music and spend time with music for its own sake. You know, we touched on this earlier in this conversation about preference and about playing music that we're asked to play, and how we juggle that with our own sensibilities and our own preferences. So this has been a time to just absorb music, to listen to music, and to learn music for its own sake without having a particular deadline or aspiration, or professional aspiration with it. So I've been using this time to reflect on some of that, and for that, you know, I'm definitely fortunate, and it's enriching in many ways. Just on a practical level, you know, it's a time to learn new repertoire and you know, plan programs, plan ideas for the future, which you'll be doing in the next few years, and that's exciting too.
Taking the time limits off of music making in the way that we have has, I think, allowed a lot of people to really look inward for answers to that. Like, what do I want to be doing music wise? What music do I want to be making, and how do I want to be making it? And, of course, there's nothing equal to being in a great concert hall and playing on a nice instrument and feeling the physicality of the space, and playing for an audience and sort of absorbing their energy and mirroring it back to them, and shaping shaping that energy with your own contributions musically. But now is the time we get to really think about what is it, what am I doing, what am I adding to the world, and what can I add to the world. And I think for a lot of people who musicians operate on a very deadline based schedule and are often trying to finish something just in time for the performance, just in time for the recording, that sort of thing, that it's a really unique opportunity. I certainly feel this way to just branch out and maybe work on a style or a genre that you wouldn't normally approach because you don't have time, or to just deepen your understanding and appreciation of something that was more on the margins of what you're typically doing. And I don't think that I would ask for this situation again. The benefits don't outweigh the disadvantages, but I think we as artists have a duty to take this time and figure out how we can use it to our advantage, and how we can make the most of the situation rather than sort of feel defeated and sidelined by it.
And I agree. And I think, all of us as humans are looking within ourselves, and, this is challenging us in so many ways. And I think if we look at history, it's often that during these times when people do find what really is needed for their cultural enrichment, for their spiritual enrichment. So I have a feeling that once this is all over, that there'll be a longing, sort of a rich appreciation for the arts and for music that maybe will run deeper than it ever did for many people. And I think that that's why it's important for us during this time to continue to find outlets, to continue to of course release music online for people to appreciate and enjoy, because I think it's during these times when what we do is needed the most.
One way that I've had this put to me is that, the way that you could best define music is something that's sort of bounded by silence, and whatever is within the boundaries of that silence is music, because you're controlling the time, you're controlling the space of it. And we can hope that the silence of the art, the silencing of the arts by this pandemic, can sort of make even more meaningful the art that we're able to make once we're able to safely re-enter a concert hall and safely perform for audiences. That lack will have elevated the music that we're able to make afterwards. So Matthew, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me twice. And thank you so much for sharing your artistry with the Lancaster Symphony. We're all really looking forward to the day when we get back together and work with you again. It's going to be a tremendous artistic experience, and that day can't come soon enough for me.
Thank you so much for having me, and please stay well, and I hope to and look forward to seeing everyone soon.